Let's go ahead and get started. Yes, woo! Okay, welcome to the New York City Drupal community's monthly meetup. I'm Scott Rigby. I work at NBCU, filling in for Alex. I'm not going to start out with a joke, just because. But one thing that is the case in Alex's absence is he often also hosts an Ask Me Anything, otherwise known as a newbie kind of. It's not really a newbie, but it's a. If you have any question, go ahead and throw it on the table. Do we have anyone who would like to volunteer to run that? If we don't have to do it, but if anyone would like to volunteer to run it, we can still do it. If no one wants to volunteer to run it, we will just not do it. And you can just feel free to also ask questions somewhere near the end after the two presentations that happen. So, and as a pretty small group, I don't see any immediate hands, so I'm going to assume that we're just going to all hang out together and it'll be totally accessible for all levels here. Okay. So first thing, and you'll note my teleprompting here with our 20 monitors around us. The bathrooms, the men's restroom is over there for the few people that haven't used it 1,000 times. Through that door, down the hallway on the left. The women's restroom is the other direction. So obviously please mute your devices unless you have an awesome ringtone, in which case leave it on. And of course, if we're talking, we have a couple of people that can help pass around these mics. We have a few of them. So if you do ask a question, just try to remember to speak into the mic. And the only reason for that is so that when people watch this on YouTube later, the millions of viewers that we'll have, they'll be able to hear you. Yeah, so we're ever so slightly behind, but these announcements won't take very long. So we're going to have two talks today, one by Ben Jevons and one by Frank Carey. Also, if anyone has ideas for future talks, please talk to Ben. And Ben, where are you? Maybe he's not. Oh, there he is. So please, I think there's another slide with Ben's email, but just shouting that out so you can get your mind going. Also, shout out to Fastly for sponsoring the after party. Woo, Fastly, yes! And thanks for the beer and the good company. Please join us downstairs at Bill's Bar and Burger. There'll be a giant group, well, a small group going, so just follow the crowd. Okay, and the talks. I think before the talks we wanted to have. Yeah. Oh, coming up on the slides. Okay, so I kind of jumped the gun by announcing these. Here are the talks. We'll get more into detail when we do them. Okay, also, give a shout out to half of the audience here who are the Drupal NYC organizers tonight. Hard work is appreciated. And as always, if anybody feels super cash rich, feel free to chip in to offset the meetup.com costs, like $1 will do or whatever. Yes, and give a shout out to my employer, NBCU Technology, for providing pizza and this space. They will appreciate me saying that. And again, after party, yes, by Fastly, very cool. Okay. Take photos, but if you do, try to group people together so it looks like more people. I cannot get enough of this one. But anyhow, yeah, feel free to do that. I myself have never done it, but maybe I will tonight. And we do have a Slack channel, Drupal. Wait, is that true? Drupal-NYC-Slack? I think it's just drupalnyc.slack.com, right? Oh, right, okay, so yeah, visit the IO page if you have never done this before. If you do have a Slack client, go ahead and type in Drupal NYC, right, and then you'll get in. Okay, awesome. So we have a couple of events. There's the NYC Play Day, not happening. Wait, okay, NYC Play Day is not happening this month, right? Okay, all right. Clearly I didn't really review this beforehand. Then let me just make sure to read the point. Okay, so the happy hour is happening this month, February 22nd. That's cool. Drupal Camp New Jersey. Did someone want to come up and give a shout out for Drupal Camp New Jersey, or are we going to wait on that? Did Joe want to? Oh. Awesome. Okay, doing great here. Okay, so then Drupal Camp NYC is next, and that's on the 18th. I didn't say in voice that Drupal Camp New Jersey is on February 3rd for those who can't read this. But then, yep, so there we go. And please, well, for those who are not Drupal Association members, Frank. Oh, right. Awesome. Okay, cool. Wait a second.
The Drupal meetup, or the Drupal drink up, I guess you'd say, our drink social event will be downtown, not at our usual House of Brews location. So if you haven't come yet because it's maybe too far uptown, please go on to the link and sign up. Thanks.
Cool. Right. So that's the meetup.com Drupal NYC for happy hour. Cool. All right. Yeah, and if you're not part of the Drupal Association, it helps. You know, every little bit helps. Getting a membership is great. I have one, so that's cool. Go ahead. It's cheap. And so this is what I was talking about earlier. If you're interested in speaking for any reason, if you've got ideas for a short presentation, a cool idea, something that you're collaborating on with other people, or some awesome initiative, please contact this guy, and here's some more info.
Yeah, I was just going to see who has recently launched a Drupal site. Anybody in the audience? Both of you are not local, so I'm going to see if anybody who's always local has launched a Drupal site recently. Oh, wow. Okay. Michael, what have you launched recently?
I launched the new University of Michigan Med School site.
Awesome. Who would be curious at some point in the future to learn more about the University of Michigan website? Awesome. So let's invite Michael back sometime maybe to present about that. If you launch a website, if you're working on anything Drupal related or some cool web technology and just want to share some part that you're excited about it, whether you demo it or just kind of talk about something that you learned recently, please reach out to myself or one of the other organizers. We'd love to just hear about it. It can be a short talk or a long talk. Anything at all is very interesting. You know, my contact info is up here, or definitely just look for one of the organizers and let us know.
Cool. Thank you, Ben. Yeah, that sounds awesome, Mike. I would love to hear about that. Okay, so we're at the who's hiring, who's looking. Is there anyone in the room who is looking for work right now? Raise your hand. Okay, cool. Got a couple of people. Does anyone want to say anything about that? Do you want to announce and let people know who you are? I saw one hand. I might have missed another one.
Yeah, sure. I'm Kenny. I'm currently a student, and I'm really just looking for an internship. You know, there's not a lot of entry-level internships out there available, to my knowledge. So, yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Meet up with folks who is looking looking for people right now. Anybody hiring, looking for interns?
I'm Ryan. I'm from Pantheon, and we're actually looking for agency and community engineers, so people who will be kind of the technical side of the business apparatuses. We're just set up an office here in New York City, which is me as of right now, so we're looking to expand. If you know or like Pantheon or are interested in being involved in the Drupal community here, then come talk to me.
Hey, I'm Victor from Talent Acquisition here at NBC Technology. So if any of you guys have me looking, I'm going to be right in the back, and I'll leave some cards if you want to reach out to me at a later date. Yeah, thank you.
All right, cool. Yeah, so Talent Acquisition at NBC. I should have said that in the first place. Any case, yeah, so hook up with each other. Everything's awesome. Yeah, so you guys will be out there. Cool. All right. Okay, yeah, so this is the time where we get to introduce yourself to ideally someone you don't know. That's the ideal.
about 1 minute.
Okay. You don't have to take 5 minutes. But
Oh, really? Should we like
We're having a good time.
should we cut it short? Yeah, but should we cut it short or extend it?
Look around.
you're the MC. You make the call.
With great power comes great responsibility. I'm just gonna.
Oh, I did it.
I grabbed it from the top. I didn't have a separate one. I just set it down.
So, yeah, that was crazy. Without making a ton of noise. No, I mean,
Good idea. Wow.
80% of the time, no problem. They can install it with their phone.
We're not there.
Maybe it's not.
Yeah.
I think I'm not small.
More than you think. Yeah, that's what's nice is we get, I mean, we definitely skew more to voters, but like we get a variety. It's really great.
But if you ever want, we could have a question panel.
Yeah.
We used to work in do you know how to handle any question? And then you have a developer. Yeah. But I think you have Marvin and and then you have someone like me. No. Nobody wants to go into it. It would be like I would have a consistent response to every question. I don't know. I love that. I think you're a comedian.
Oh, yeah, that'd be good. Just figure out anything like that. Yeah. Yeah.
That's my dream someday.
Do you have any interesting jokes already?
No, I don't. Are you still playing Pinochle? Wait, I saw you on your Twitter. You were on after the recent coding sprint. I saw you were playing cards or something. What was the game you were playing? Oh, no, of course.
I will put it on because I would do like a quick 2-3 minute update.
I haven't played that in years, but I did recognize it. And then they came out with Super Uno. I remember.
No, this is the Super Mario Brothers edition of Uno.
Oh, that's crazy, like, oh, very nice. I like that. Yes, super geeky. Yes, great.
No, we went with like the old school rules because Garrett and I were trying to figure out how we remember to play Uno. I was saying that you can be really evil and try to like play draw two against each other and still run out of cards. And the last guy who stuck with it can draw like 12 or 14 cards.
Right. But how does the game change with the Mario Edition version?
I think you also have like 2 blind cards where you can name the punishment of however you like. But we decided that we're not that evil. We're just going to say, I was like, there's plenty of evil rules in there that will keep the game going.
Okay. We're good. We're good. I let it go over a little bit.
So you have to be a princess.
Okay, we're back.
Okay.
I know. That was more like 7 minutes, but people were having so much fun. Okay, cool. Well, we can always continue after at Joe's Bar. Wow. It's a good thing that Bill's Bar is not sponsoring this event, because otherwise I would be like so screwed. Okay. Yeah, Fastly's Bar downstairs. There you go.
Hey, I'm Joe. Let me get this little thing. So okay, so we're back. Drupal Camp. This is our 11th incarnation. And we're hosting it at John Jay College again, which is on the west side. It's pretty easy to get to. Well, first off, if anybody's going to bike there, you could park your bike inside the building. And if you want more information about that, we put up a page on the website, drupalcamp.nyc. But you can get there by bus or train, etc.
City bike.
Yeah, you could do a city bike. Although they probably do have a city bike spot at John Jay.
Yeah, massive.
Right on the north side of the 10th Avenue entrance. Okay, great. So let me move on, and I'll give you a couple more pieces of information. So, have anybody ever not been to an unconference? Okay. So, this is a pretty long link. You're going to be able to see it, but it's the coolest thing in the world because you just show up, and we, as a group, pick and organize our sessions. That doesn't mean you just show up cold. And, cold, we want you to be able to prepare presentations. I'm preparing a presentation on editorial workflow, like what that really looks like. I worked at the New York Times many years ago. I worked at the Associated Press. Been working in Drupal since 2006. That's going to be my focus. There are other people who are going to be doing really cool presentations. A guy, Aaron, I think his last name's Wolf. is coming up. He's the maintainer of the Salesforce suite of Drupal modules that are getting ported now. If anybody uses them, it's a really great opportunity to hear the roadmap. And please, you guys could think about, well, first off, in the simplest sense, these are your 4 tracks: site builder, developer, DevOps, front end, theming. If anybody has case studies on Drupal, we'll also accept them. The only thing we want people to do is focus on Drupal 8 this time around. We want to try to, if we can avoid Drupal 7 presentations, that would be great. Also, the other thing that we're doing is that we have a half-day's training. That may be on a slide later, but if it isn't, then I forgot about it, that's going to be held all morning. So if any of you are new to Drupal, particularly Drupal 8, if you have any colleagues or friends that you know want to learn more about Drupal, it's a phenomenal opportunity to learn some more about it. Now, if you need any ideas for sessions, please feel free to email me. Oh, I forgot to also mention Jake, I think you've committed to doing, I hate to, but he's going to give us hopefully a roadmap and a little more in depth about web form module, which is also going to be exciting. So I don't know if others have, anybody else thinking about presenting? Where's Eric? Well, Frank, great. Okay, I don't know where Eric went, but I'm gonna grab him. Okay, so David's gonna be doing the training. And here's your registration information. We are working on a cool, could be a t-shirt, could be a bag or something like that. It's gonna be just for the first 100 people who register. So there's another 20, 30 slots for that. So I would encourage you to try to register today or tomorrow. So, and you got to be there to get your little thing, because I'm not going to find you guys and give you a t-shirt later on. But I guarantee what we're working on is going to be probably funny, maybe a little bit politically tinged for some of your taste. I don't know. It's right up my alley. For those of you who know me, you probably already know what's going on. But that's it. Thank you. Any questions about the camp? February 18th. We will have an after party that night too. It's on a really great Irish bar on 72nd Street. We all just walk right up there. So hopefully you guys will join us there. Here's
Ho-Ling, were you going to say something?
Hi guys. Over the weekend on Saturday, we did a global sprint weekend so I'm going to do a little recap. So we basically worked really hard, as you can see in the room. And the lunch was delicious. Thank you, Phase 2, for sponsoring our food. At the end of the day, the 8 or 9 of us, we tackled 12 issues and case studies together. That's alive for like a Saturday. Thank you. And then for the after party, we play Uno. So the quote from Twitter, some post Drupal sprint Uno, last 2 players accumulating cards, the struggle was real. Thank you.
Oh my God, that was awesome.
All right. I think Ben is up next. Ben Jevons? Anyone? There we go. I should introduce Ben. Ben is an awesome dude. D.O, security team guy. What else can I say? Has a presentation. Here you go.
Give it up for Scott. Thank you, Scott. And if somebody, maybe Ho-Ling, if you would please just swap the display back there.
Oh, got it.
Okay, let's see. I'm not mirroring displays, so this always becomes fun. There we go. Oh, did it as a separate tab. So I'm going to talk about Drupal and security, but in the context of some security attacks that have happened. We'll walk through an attack and looking at what exactly happened with that attack and sort of talk about securing your sites, being proactive and reactive when that happens. And I want to start with a story. And it's a story from the news. You might remember it. We had so many different stories like this. Target was hacked, as many of you probably know. What I think is most interesting about this, one of the more interesting details is sort of like what it cost the company, right? I mean, it cost the people that this affected quite dearly. A lot of them were able to, like, I think, get back some of the money that was like stolen and stuff, but it cost the company quite a bit. And so I won't get into the details too much of this attack, but basically 110 million records, like customer records and other pieces of data, sort of records, were stolen from Target. And it ended up costing the company $162 million to recover from this attack. So my point sort of being that, like, security hacks happen, they're very expensive, and when you are just reacting to them, it can be very sort of costly. And so the things you can do proactively to prevent that is where I want to sort of focus. So with this particular hack, it affected nearly 1 in 3 American consumers. And what it came down to is, had they actually responded in the process of the attack, sort of getting alerted to it and acting upon that alert, they probably would have prevented it. So there was a failure in their incident response. We'll talk a little bit about responding to a security attack incidents. When that happens, it's pretty bad, but you've got to respond to it correctly. In Target's case, they might have prevented losing $162 million over this. My name is Ben, and I work at Card.com. We're a sort of mobile, modern alternative to a traditional branch bank. I'm not going to get into any of that, so we can talk about that afterward if that interests you at all. But I am a member of the Drupal security team, so some of this information comes from being part of that team. The team really doesn't have a lot to do with like preventing attacks. It's mostly about making sure modules on Drupal.org are secure by putting out security advisories. Would love to talk more about that. We have several members here from the Drupal security team, so if that, being part of the security team interests you, come talk to us. We're always looking for more members and more folks to help. So what I'm going to talk about is how one particular Drupal site got hacked, what happened in that attack, and what you can do for your own Drupal sites or even your non-Drupal sites when that sort of thing happens. So we're gonna get into the story of this attack. And this story is based on real, actual events. Some details have been changed. Some have been kind of combined with other stories. So let's meet our hero in this story. So our hero is working on a website, right? Maybe you work on a website. You're poking around. Maybe you're writing some code. Maybe you're writing a new module, working on some files. Maybe you're managing the server. And you stumble upon something a little odd in your normal day-to-day work. There's a weird file that you don't recognize with Drupal. What is this file? Content-in next to index.php. This is pretty weird. So you open it up because you're not really too sure about what it is, and you see something pretty strange. What is this? Well, it's in your root directory of your website next to your index.php. So you're like, well, maybe I'll just go to this file in my web browser and see what happens. And you get this weird sort of like just password prompt. This isn't anything you've seen before in Drupal. Pretty strange. What is this? It's a PHP shell. Been hacked. So what a PHP shell is, it's a backdoor that's capable of doing a lot of different things. One of the things, and this is a quote from the particular person in this situation who found the shell, said in chat, it's capable of downloading, injecting, and installing new binaries and processes into the system. So it's a backdoor into your server to execute anything that person wants to execute in the context of your server. Been hacked. Game over, right? That's it. You're hacked. You just pack up and leave? No, because everybody gets hacked nowadays, right? Welcome to the real world. This is a shot from a website that sort of tracks data breaches, showing the number of records stolen from different websites. This is just the last couple years, and you can see this is the number of records. So it's the size of the circle is more records. So I mean, you see Yahoo on there, eBay, Chase, Target was hacked, Anthem, the Office of Personnel Management. It's not just big companies though that are getting hacked. This is the number of records, and it sort of seems like big organizations. It can be small organizations as well. This is kind of an older stat, but still very relevant. I think that Verizon does a data data breach investigations report every single year. And in their 2012 study found that a lot of attacks actually happen in small businesses. So it's not something that you have to worry about when you're a big player in the space. It can happen to everybody. It happened to Drupal.org. So Drupal.org got hacked. And if you had an account on Drupal.org, you had to reset your password. And it's probably actually happened to everybody in this room, or most people in this room. So there's a website called haveibeenpwned.com that you can type in your email address or a username that you use on sites, and it'll show you what sort of public data breaches your account has been in. So a lot of people are taking photos of this slide because it's kind of scary. It's like you had a Adobe account maybe in the past. Well, maybe your email address is public and the password you had with Adobe is in public. So hopefully you're not using that password anyplace else, right? Because attackers probably know it now. It happened to WordPress, and in fact, when WordPress sites got hacked, they were used in what's referred to as a distributed denial of service attack. So a WordPress site was used to hack other sites or send malicious traffic at other sites. So this stuff is out there. It's pretty scary. Let's kind of move on and think about sort of like why hackers do what they do, and in particular what the hacker did with that site that we saw just moments ago. So why do people hack? I won't go much further than this into this, but sometimes it's financial reasons. Maybe they want to steal private data. Maybe it's espionage or something. Maybe it's just like damaging reputation or like getting a laugh. Maybe it's influencing an election. There's lots of different reasons people are hacking. So let's look at our story of that hack. So we were back. We had a PHP shell. It doesn't end there. Let's start asking some questions. How did it get there? How was it accessed, and when was it accessed? And what else might have happened because that PHP shell was there? How can we sort of like dive into that and understand what really happens? So every web server by default usually, or it's configurable, will record logs of people accessing the website, accessing the web server. So this is a screenshot of my local web server running on my machine, the access logs for that web server as I was like working on the website. So I can see that when I'm on a web browser making requests at my local website, the local web server is recording those requests. So we're making requests, that's a GET request, to particular paths on the website. Okay, well we can use these access logs to sort of look and see if anybody accessed that PHP shell, that content-in. So we can look through access logs using a tool called grep. We search for content-in, and we find that there were requests to that PHP file. And the 200 here sort of at the end says that the web server said, okay, here's that shell. I do have that shell. Here it is for you. And then we can see that somebody requested it a couple times, and then they made a post request. So they started using that shell to do something. So we now know that somebody found that PHP shell and they started to use it. Okay, so what else happened? Maybe how did it get installed? And what else can we learn from it? So along with those access logs, there's an IP address sort of for the person who was using that PHP shell. So we're going to use that IP address and then find what else they did on the system in our access logs. So in this case, we start looking through the access logs for that IP address. We find that they use the PHP shell. They also use, we found a few other records. There was some other stuff that they were using on the site. Did any of these jump out to anybody? So we got a PHP myadmin. We get it and we post. And then there's /user down at the bottom. Well, so at the time when this attack happened, the people working on this were a little bit surprised to find PHP myadmin. So they went to their server and they typed in PHP myadmin, and lo and behold, PHP myadmin was installed on the site. And the developers were going, I don't know how that got there. So in the chat log of this is just another one, and again, the innocent people are protected here. Chatting about it, we're like, oh my gosh, you can log into PHP myadmin with the default credentials, which are by default from that platform at that time was root and no password, logs you into PHP myadmin, a little OMFG. So this person who used the PHP shell also used PHP myadmin, and then what else did they do here? They sent data to /user, which is the Drupal path for logging in to a user account. And you can see that very bottom request is to user/1, which is the admin account on Drupal sites. And it's to 200, meaning somebody logged into this IP address, logged into Drupal and got access. A little scary, right? So what do we know at this point? We've read through access logs. We know that we had phpMyAdmin installed on the server with no password, and that was a surprise. That person used phpMyAdmin presumably to read the database, because phpMyAdmin is a tool for managing MySQL databases. So they used that to read from the database, and then they logged into Drupal. So in this case, this was a Drupal 6 site they were logging into. So one unfortunate thing about Drupal 6 sites is the password for different accounts was not securely hashed. It was just an MD5, so very easy to reverse. So that person used that password to log in, and then probably, and the access log showed this, used Drupal itself to upload a PHP shell, because Drupal 6 and 7 made it very easy to execute PHP in the user interface. There was sort of more stuff that happened. The database was dumped, and so presumably any accounts on that site were stolen, and that would be like one of those cases that we saw before about a breached database. Game over. So that was just one example of a site attack. In that case, it was abusing basically normal authentication to a site, into a Drupal site. Basically, the phpMyAdmin was the vector to get access to use the administration account on the site, and then installing a PHP shell, and then the PHP shell, might have been able to do other things on the server, maybe like sending out spam messages, or perhaps like getting around with the rest of the system. But there's many other ways that you could have been hacked. So in Drupal specifics, there was a vulnerability a long time ago in an UberCart module that allowed cross-site scripting. And that cross-site scripting basically allowed somebody to change the details of who was getting paid. So maybe you had your site configured with one payment gateway, but this cross-site scripting attack allowed you to sort of change some of those details and alter how much you paid for that product that you were checking out with. There's been cases of Flash vulnerabilities. So there's an open source tool called Open Flash Chart that has been abused to write files to the server, used for the exact same sort of scenario where a PHP shell gets written. So this example is, in both those cases, UberCart and this Open Flash Chart, the site was running out-of-date vulnerabilities. So the attackers just looked to see, hey, is this site running this known vulnerable piece of code? And if so, exploited it. Some other cases is just going down the street and looking for doors you can open, people who haven't locked up their site. So an example of this is when you run on shared hosting, which presumably people don't use as often anymore for production or business related sites, maybe your personal sites on a shared host. But one risk of a shared host is that there's a lot of people on one server, and so you trust that your neighbor has secured their site. If somebody can sort of abuse and hack into your neighbor's site, maybe they can sort of piggyback to get access to the whole server, and then they have everybody's information on that server. So in Drupal speak, maybe if somebody hacks one person's Drupal site and is able to execute PHP, they could read the settings.php file for all the other sites on that host, meaning they could get database credentials for every other site. And then there was Drupalgeddon, or Drupal SA05, which was the big hack or the big vulnerability in Drupal sites. And this was already 2 years ago, I think in 2015, that this came out. And it was just one single request allowed somebody to do SQL injection and actually even PHP execution against a Drupal site. And so this came out, it was October 2014. Man, time flies. So if you were running a Drupal 7 site at this time, you were vulnerable. It was a pretty big deal. But the good thing about this one is that prior to this attack, it was 7 years for the last Drupal-specific hack. It's not that common. There's a lot of eyes on the code. This one was a really big deal, but thankfully there hasn't been a lot of stuff since. Yeah, I see Michael knocking on wood. Okay, so we've seen a hack. We've seen a few examples of a hack. Let's get on to how we can secure ourselves. So the way that I think you should attack this problem or think about this problem is think about what attackers are doing. They're opportunistic. They're going to try to find the most vulnerable people and then exploit them, or they're going to basically spray and pray. They're going to like look for lots of different vulnerable people and hack the people that they can. So if you have a very specific like business, or you have something that like you have a lot of secure and special data, you want to lock that down, but you almost just want to be like more secure than your neighbor. So there's a story of the lion and the gazelle. When a lion wakes up in the morning, what does the lion have to do? The lion knows that it has to be faster than the slowest gazelle. And what does the gazelle have to do when it wakes up in the morning? It has to be faster. It has to be faster than the slowest gazelle, right? So you want to be ahead of the pack. So there's a lot of stuff you can do. This is just sort of a quick list, and I'll run through some of these. The first one is very important, just run up-to-date software. I'll get into a little bit more of that as it relates to Drupal. Secure your passwords and your accounts. Secure the default configuration, things like that, phpMyAdmin, making sure that if you're installing software that you're reviewing the default configuration. Making sure that you connect to your sites securely, so you transfer data securely, so this is SFTP and HTTPS. Educate your team, so learn what you can about securing stuff and share that knowledge with others. So on that first point about keeping up to date, as it relates to Drupal, there's lots of ways to be aware of updates. There's a Twitter account and an RSS feed, but when you are aware of those, you actually want to apply them. You want to review to see if those affect you, and then actually go ahead and apply those. Some good practices around doing this is using things like version control and configuration management. This is too much to get into in this talk, but maybe just sort of remember those terms if you're not thinking about those yet as they relate to staying up to date. For tracking updates, there's the Drupal security Twitter account. Drupal itself will detect and tell you about updates to code and modules. There's an RSS feed and mailing list as well. And the important thing also here is really do this for all software. So we're talking about Drupal a lot here, but it really affects like every piece of software you're running on your sites and your systems. So when you go to apply those, you want to, let's say that like something like Drupal SA05, the Drupal Geddon attack comes out again. If you have a really sort of slow review and application process for updates, it's going to mean that you're vulnerable to a public issue for much longer. So if you can get into sort of quick ways and automated ways of testing updates and applying them and getting them released, that's going to reduce your exposure for a public vulnerability. So you want to automate tests, you want to automate delivery, and you want to automate sort of release of things when you can. And you even, to an extent, want to automate auditing. So there's a couple of Drupal modules out there that will do things like look at the configuration of your site, look at the user accounts of your site, and tell you if things are insecure. And you can automate that sort of thing. If you use Jenkins or if you use any other sort of tool, automate that sort of check and alert you if something's wrong. You want to secure accounts. So people talk about strong passwords, two-factor authentication, auditing accounts, educating against phishing. These are all sort of in that same vein, like making sure people have secure passwords so that if you have a password in an Adobe breach or one of these other public databases, somebody can't log into your corporate site or your business site or your personal email with that password. Two-factor authentication helps with that, but it's not foolproof. And then auditing sort of the access that you have given to people. And another way to think about strong passwords is to think about them more as like phrases. I mean, people talk about that like, you have to use a password with a number and a capital letter and an exclamation point. Well, people end up doing weak passwords that just follow those rules. They'll do password 1 or something with a capital P. That's easy to remember, but also easy to hack. So think about passphrases. Maybe use a tool that helps you manage passwords like LastPass or 1Password. And then in your Drupal site, there's modules called password policy and password strength, which can help you set this up for your users. And then don't forget that it doesn't end there. There's no silver bullet to security. So you want to think about tactics of employing defense in depth, encrypting data, making backups and actually testing your backup, and then hacking yourself. So if anybody runs like anything around like payments or anything around like finances, you have to go through PCI certification. There's like reviews you have to do. But you can also take that mentality, if you're not working in that sort of industry, you can take that mentality and just think about, well, what are the ways that my system is vulnerable, and rethink the way that you build it, and try to hack yourself and see if you get someplace, and then fix it. And again, just remember to stay ahead of the pack. So it's something you got to keep working on, but unfortunately plan for the worst. So be proactive, but sometimes things happen, you have to be reactive. So I won't get really much further into this, but there's ideas of incident response, having a very clear process for when something happens, containing the issue, restoring services, documenting what happens, and doing reporting. There's a great drupalize.me post about this from Joe Schindler. It's up on their site at node/1974. That's pretty good. Goes into depth about all of this. Okay, so maybe you're feeling good or you're feeling a little bliss. It's maybe a lot to think about. So I'll just leave you with this stuff. Everybody gets hacked. Keep your site and your software up to date. Secure passwords, review default configuration, and plan for the worst. So I'll just throw a few links up here, and thank you, everybody. Yeah, or we got, I think, a little bit of time for Q&A, if anything.
Questions?
All right.
So when was the last time you were hacked?
Am I hacked right now? It's a little bit dangerous when Michael asked me that. I think the last time that I went through one of these was at Acquia. So yeah, so it's a few years back. Yeah. Anybody else who wants to share like a horror story of a hack that they had or anything that they learned from that one?
Well, I used to work at Sony. So we went through all that. And I just say something, sometimes people don't, our group never got hacked, the Drupal group. But what we saw was that people were seeing the content of the site and they were thinking like, there's no credit card numbers here. There's nothing that's that important. So what's the big deal kind of thing. And as those things fell out and people had their emails available in the public, not just that, but their passwords, because everyone uses the same password everywhere. So it might be the same as your banking account. So even though we didn't give up your bank account, if somebody releases your password like that, that's an issue. So I would just keep in mind that if your group isn't thinking about these things, that you should be, and that organizations like Sony went from sort of not thinking about it whatsoever to sort of draconian checks to even push any bit of code. So it sort of behooves you to, even as a lowly developer or whatever, to start bringing these things up with people early.
And just to follow up on that, like a really good point is like if you have sites that you're running, like and people are creating accounts on those sites, you have a duty, I think, to those users. If you get hacked, you've now made them, them vulnerable. So anything you can do to secure your users' accounts is really important. Things like Drupal 7 has a more secure password scheme than Drupal 6. Drupal 8 has made it harder to, doesn't ship with the PHP filter, so makes it a lot harder to execute PHP code in the user interface. There's a lot more you can do to sort of secure your site for your own users too.
Yeah, question about audits, site audits. And since we're in a Drupal meetup and talking a little bit about Drupal, are there specific places that you recommend people look during a site audit, specifically in the database? And I guess I'm thinking not necessarily about obvious exploits, but about Easter eggs that can be, dealt with later. And let's just assume that we're talking about a site that does not have a PHP filter module.
So an audit for a vulnerability?
Yeah.
Like auditing.
Not necessarily vulnerability, because you often, as you said before, you don't really know how it happened. Sometimes without forensics, and even sometimes then you're not even sure how it happened. You just know that it did. But for preventative purposes, do you have any kind of automation that? Yeah.
For the database, it's hard to sort of isolate the database alone and say like what to review there, because it all depends on how like information is getting into the database. So it depends on like where like user input. So it's based on like tables like field tables or node tables, any of that sort of stuff about user input and where it's getting into the database. I think is where you should focus. What first came to mind though is there's a module called Account Sentinel, which tracks changes to user accounts. So you can tell it what your administrative accounts are, and it'll send you an email whenever a password changes, not with the password password is, but just if the password changed or if somebody became an administrator on your site. So it's a way to audit changes to administrative roles. And it includes a way where it does, in case somebody sort of bypassed it from the PHP standpoint, it'll do SQL queries itself to sort of check if, like, you know, somebody exploited a SQL injection to insert something to the user roles table, for instance. So that sort of mindset, I think, is important to, like, there's PHP and then there's MySQL, but there's, you have to think about the input.
Security review module.
Yeah, there's another good sort of audit module called security review module. And when I say good, I should disclaim that I'm an author of the module, but.
So who wrote that one?
Yeah.
I would look at the, so after SAO5 happened, what was happening is the email addresses for users were being changed, and a bunch of hackers made the email address security@drupal.org. So people were doing password resets, and the security team was getting the password email with, you know, live credentials to UID1 in some, you know, fairly large sites. Good thing we moderate mail.
Okay, thanks, everybody. Let's see, we'll pass it back to Scott.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, guess I'll take this one. Okay, so next up, I think next up is Frank, right? Awesome. I guess I should just say Frank's from HelioCore, DevOps dude. There you go. Do you want this on the stand or in your hand? All right.
All done. Hi, so I'm Frank Carey from HelioCore, and I've been a Drupal community member for a long time. I think I was at one of those. If we've done these for 11 years, then I think I was at one of the very early ones. It was sort of my introduction to the New York community, and so we at HelioCore do a lot of DevOps-oriented things. But we also help people set up their local development environments, developer workflows, and things like that. So debugging is one of those things that I think a lot of people know that they should do, but they sort of reach for the things that are the most comfortable and that they're used to. And so I'm going to do my best to convince you that you should never, ever use a DPM or something like that again. It's fine if you disagree, but hopefully I can make the case. So we're going to focus today on a PHP extension called Xdebug. It's been around since 2002, written by Derek Rethens, and like any other PHP extension, it's written in C. This one's also open source. And what it does is, as your PHP process starts, or as you get a request from the Apache web server, the module boots up, basically, and it reaches out on port 9000 to a specific IP address that you configure and tries to communicate with that. And what it's trying to communicate usually is with an IDE. And so we're going to go through that. So one of the things that people find tricky about is just getting Xdebug set up. So how many people have Xdebug completely set up and like easily accessible at a moment's notice? Okay. Right now, yes. Not like, oh, well, I think I have to go to some INI file and I have to change something. So it's that kind of challenge that that we'll get to in a minute. But part of it that people start, trying to set this up on their own, and then they get stymied and then they quit, right? So it's happened to me the first few times, years ago when I was trying to set this up. So it's helpful to understand sort of how Xdebug works. So Xdebug works sort of opposite the way most people think it works. So that's sort of why this is important, and I'll focus on it. So when Xdebug starts, it starts when your PHP process starts. And what it does is it kind of picks up the phone, it calls an IP address, and usually port 9000. And if someone answers the phone, it's going to have a communication with that system, and that's your IDE. If no one answers, if it goes to voicemail, it just continues on with its business. Say, okay, I'm just going to run the rest of the process. I'm going to go all the way through to the end, and I'm just going to ignore you. So what's important here then is that, I'll go through the whole thing here. So Xdebug says, hey, is anybody listening? If your ID is listening, it says, hey Xdebug, hold on a second. I want you to stop at these certain breakpoints. So at that point, it says, okay, I won't just drive on. I'll actually look for those breakpoints for you. And eventually it'll come back and say, okay, I did hit a breakpoint. And if it didn't hit a breakpoint, it'll just continue on. And if it did hit a breakpoint, it'll stop. It'll actually pause the execution of the PHP script and say, well, what do you want me to do now? And so that's the interactions you're going to see back and forth between PHP Storm and Xdebug. So just keep that in mind. Like if things aren't working where you're starting your process and Xdebug or whatever PHP Storm or whatever your IDE isn't sort of catching that, then there's probably something wrong where it's talking to the wrong IP address or the wrong port. So again, people usually get stymied around the setup. It's pretty easy to install. So if you're on Linux, you can install it with Peckle. If you're on Homebrew, you can use Homebrew to install it. Just make sure you're installing the specific version that you have with Homebrew. So if you're just using OS 10 and you don't have PHP installed with Homebrew, make sure you install PHP first and then install Homebrew. Something else to keep in mind is that just installing it does one thing, but you actually have to enable the module and you have to set the settings in a php.ini. Another thing to remember is that often the CLI version of your PHP has a different INI file than your, say, Apache version. So you may have to set this in two places if you want to set it up so if you want to use Drush, for instance, you want to debug some Drush stuff that you're running, then you'll have to do that. So what IP address do we have? So this gets people caught. So generally speaking, like how many people are using, sort of have something on the left-hand side here that they're running? They're running native PHP. They're not running inside of Docker container, or Vagrant, or VM, or anything like that. So if you're running XAMPP or Dev Desktop or Homebrew, just that regular version PHP, you can just talk to the local. This is your local host basically. If you're running something like Drupal VM, Vagrant, VirtualBox, Docker, or just even talking to a remote server. Well, remote server is a little different, but let's say those three. You have to figure out what your gateway is. So usually like SSHing into your VirtualBox, if you just do an IP or an ifconfig to find the IP address, generally speaking, whatever the IP address, so it's usually something like 192.168 dot something something, and then whatever your local IP address is, the gateway is usually .1. Well, it's always .1. So that's the IP address that you're going to want to use for the setup. Right? So just keep those two things in mind. Either if you're setting up locally, you're going to use localhost. If you're setting up in something like Vagrant, you're going to want to use these settings. So the first thing to do is check if Xdebug is already running. So if you're using some setups, you may have it where it's already configured, or if you're in a large organization that has a VM or something like that, they may have already set these settings for you. So you can do that by either checking PHP info with PHP-I on the command line. So PHP info, does anyone not know what PHP info is? So PHP info would just basically output a bunch of, let's say, settings information about your PHP into a browser. PHP-I does basically the same thing, but on the command line, and you can grep for Xdebug to find the settings. If you're using Drupal 8, there's a easy way to do that. So if you're using 7, you can create a little file called info.php in your root, and then I'll show that to you right now. So I tried to up the, can you guys see that somewhat well enough? So just to do this, all you have to do is create a file called anything, and then just drop PHP info in like this, right? And go to that page, and it will show you the full listing. But if you're in Drupal 8, so that you have to do that for Drupal 7. If you're in Drupal 8, you can just go to the PHP info page. So it's at admin/reports. It's like the status page. And you can actually go through and see, it'll have a little PHP link. Let me see if I can pull it up. Right, so here's the status page from Drupal 8. And if you go to the PHP version and go to more information, it'll bring you to this page. So you don't have to do anything, which is nice. So, Is it on Drupal 7? All right, I didn't know that. So you don't have to do the first thing I said. Hopefully most of you are off at Drupal 6 by this point. So if you go, just Command F and look for Xdebug, these are Xdebug settings, right? There are a lot of Xdebug settings, right? There's only a few that we're really concerned about. Most of them you can just leave them as a default. Some of them aren't related even to debugging, right? Xdebug also provides profiling and some other things like XHProf does. So looking at our settings, we want to make sure that, just sort of installing it with Peckle, you also have to say enable it. And the way you enable it is to set the Zendex extension and the location of where the xdebug.so file is. When you install it with Peckle, and probably, they usually install like an INI file automatically, so they usually automatically sets this up. So then in some PHP INI file, it doesn't matter really which one, you need to set these 4 things. And these are the 4 things that are the most important. So xdebug remote enabling, that basically says that if I screw something up like this, let's see, place this with some gobbledygook, make sure I save it. And if I bring up my site, so this was info.php. I get a nice, if there were, I did this at the very beginning of the file, but you can get a stack trace and all kinds of goodies. So just installing Xdebug, even if you're not actively debugging something, will actually give, when you have like fatal errors, instead of getting those nasty white screens of mystery, you'll actually have something to be able to help you debug. So that's what that setting does. Where are we? Slides, there we go. So here's the remote host that we talked about before, right? So localhost, if you're sort of not doing anything out of the ordinary, but if you're on something like Docker or Vagrant, then you're gonna wanna make sure you set it to the gateway. So that allows it to sort of chirp out to the larger computer, and you have to tell it what port to talk to. The default is 9000, that's usually what things are gonna be set at. Another important one is remote auto start. So this means that there are some ways to set this up where you can sort of set a cookie or add a get parameter into your URL. I find it's not worth all of that headache. So I just have it, it's on all the time. So when you'll see when we go through the debugging itself, it just works. I don't have to remember to go back and set these things on and off. A couple other settings that are optional. You can set the IDE key. Some I think it's NetBeans has a specific, you have to set the IDE key. Most times it just works. You don't have to set anything. Also, in the more recent versions of Xdebug, the max nesting level, that's basically how many levels deep into functions it will go to report the information. The more recent, I think it's 5, what is it, 2.5 is out right now. I think 2.3 and above, it's set to 256 by default, but if you have an older version, it's set to 100. And if you have it set to 100, it'll probably die in PHP, or excuse me, with Drupal, because of how deep especially Drupal 8. So you want to make sure it's at least set to 256. So, how many people, well, here's a quick question. How many people use DPM? It's okay, I won't yell at you. How many people use DSM? Okay, do you know if there's a difference? DSM just calls DPM. So there's, I've gotten into a pedantic debate with someone about which one was the right one, but DPM is actually the official. DSM is just sort of legacy. So you can do that. You can use DPM. Drupal set message sometimes is a way to do it. And then there's just var dump, printar, echo, and things like that. So does anyone know about Drupal debug? So, if at the end of this talk you're like, screw you, I've tried this stupid debugging thing, it never works, and I don't like you, then at least use Drupal debug. So Drupal debug, instead of outputting it to a screen, it outputs it to a file called, usually in your var folder, I think Drupal _debug.txt, and it'll just keep appending, just like it would append the output to the browser window, it'll append the output into that file. So that can be really useful if you want to grep through and see when a value becomes something. There's also issues where DSM and DPM, certain situations which are weird where your messages can be reset at certain times. So you'll have DPM running somewhere, but then nothing will show up on the page, and you'll think that you never got to that code, but actually your messages just got reset. So that's something to worry about. Yeah. I'll repeat. Right. So. So so I mean, I can actually show it right quick. So there are some other devel module-based useful ones. Here's the list here. The one you mentioned was DPQ, which is for queries. So some of these things can be useful. Does it show an example? Not so much. So there can be some other functions here that you might use, but for the most part, you don't have to. So at least for DPM and DSM, I would say like you're probably best just never ever using it. If you think you need to use it, just set up your debugger finally and use that. So this is what, if anyone's not familiar with DPM and DSM, this is the traditional output, right? It gives you expandable, what would you call it? It basically sends out messages, tells you that, and you can click on these things and expand them and collapse them. So that's sort of useful. But we'll see that we can still use that with debugging. And there's a lot of limitations here, right? So just the idea that you sort of need to know where to put the DPM to even get your information out, and that's an issue. So you're sort of shooting in the dark. They're taking this trial and error approach. I've seen people spend a day debugging things that they could have found out with a debugger in 15 minutes. It ends up polluting the screen. So if you have a lot of these, it can actually slow your browser down if you have too many. Just a lot of markup. You can imagine, it looks small because it's all collapsed, but if you were to expand the entire thing, it can actually be quite a lot. It can be very memory intensive, so as it's building all of that markup, you can run out of PHP memory if you don't have it set high enough. I think one of the biggest things is that it requires altering your code, right? So how many people have forgotten to take a DPM out and done a commit, right? Yeah. So why do that to yourself? Don't alter your code if you don't have to. Because the big trick is remember to clean it up. So I mentioned that DPM is not completely reliable, right? So sometimes messages can get squashed out, and you can't do things like you can't pause the execution. It's read only. You can't change any values. And a big one is that it's only one thread. So if you have something that let's say some AJAX calls or something like that happen while you're loading the page, you'll never know about them because it's in a totally different PHP process. So there's still limitations with Xdebug, but I think they're reasonable, right? It does require an IDE. You could try doing this from Netcat or something like that, but it's a whole protocol. So it's not something you would just implement. If you don't have an IDE, actually, you can use Xdebug with a browser extension, which will actually you'll be able to step through your debugging in Chrome, for instance. It just sort of listens on through Chrome. It listens on port 9000. So it requires a PHP extension to be installed. That if you're not familiar with that, it's not that hard, but something people aren't familiar with. It does require setting some INI settings, and it does add a little overhead to PHP. So if you've run Composer with Xdebug installed, you'll get some warnings. It'll say, hey, Composer runs a lot slower with this thing on. But I find the overhead's totally worth the usefulness. So debugging with Xdebug. So the things it'll give you, and we'll show, is that you can debug in real time. You can step through the code. You can inspect all of the variables, not just the variables you wrapped DPM with. You can see the entire call stack. You can do some advanced things with breakpoints, which we'll dive into. You can do watches, which basically say, here are some variables I want you to look for in this frame, and I want to see the values of them in real time. And one really cool thing that you obviously can't do with DPM is you can change the values on the fly. So I could actually change a value while the code is running, while it's paused. I can change a value and then have it continue and do something different. So it's great if you want to hit certain situations where only maybe if something is null, some bad stuff happens, and you can't get it to happen. It's a sort of intermittent problem. You can just set it to null on the fly and then see what happens after the fact. All right. So we talked about setting up Xdebug from the Xdebug side, but what about setting up PHP Storm? So for the most part, if you just set things up and you can just, you don't have, there's not much to set up on PHP Storm. There's a little bit more to set up on PHP Storm if, God, it's so small. Do my best. I tried to pump up the, but on this screen, the fonts get even smaller. So to set things up, you know, if you normally just trigger this, you'll get a little warning at the bottom saying, hey, I don't know what you want me to do. This is where those two camps of people setting things up locally versus people setting up on the server, they're going to have to do two different things. If you're setting things up locally, Xdebug or PHP Storm is smart enough to say, okay, the code I'm looking at, I know the location of the code, and that maps with what Xdebug is telling me the location of the code is. If you're going across servers, right, if you're doing something like Xdebug or Vagrant or Docker, then your whole setup on inside the server, your code might be at var dub, right? But locally, it's under users, your username, something like that. So there has to be this mapping between the code locally and the code remote. And we set that up in PHP Storm. And we can go to PHP. Languages and frameworks. Under we can pick what version of PHP we're using. Under debug. How do I get rid of the? There we go. All right, so there's a few settings here that we want to set up. The first one I would say is the max simultaneous connection. So there may be situations where, I don't know, maybe someone's doing something in one browser and it may trigger other processes to kick off, for instance, Ajax, something like that. And so that will be more than one PHP process running at the same time. So by default, PHP Storm defaults to 1. So usually what I do is just right away increase this to 10. So that way I could handle actually multiple things being debugged at the same time. The default port is 9000, so you don't usually have to change that. And so you want to apply. And then our mappings.
Do you want to mention the break at the first line option?
We'll get to that.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
My bad. Okay.
No problem.
Frank, I do have a question. If you don't,
Sure.
if you don't change max simultaneous up from 1, will it just reject? It like won't answer.
Right. It basically
Those
is
are
like
requests.
you know, old phones, right? It's like the line's busy and the rest of your processes, they'll complete. So they won't pause, but they'll just, and you'll be like, I'm never getting to this breakpoint or something. Why am I not? So that's why it's important to set. So where are my mappings? Okay. So this usually happens by default, but you can go into your configurations and usually you'll have a server. And this is where you have to, I'm trying to think if I can do this for you right now, but it's not that complex, but basically you end up having to set, it'll throw an error if you're on a remote system like Docker, right? It'll say, hey, you want me to go to var dub your Drupal code, but that doesn't exist on the local machine. Where is this supposed to point to? And so you just have to, you know, traverse your local and set up the mapping. So, you know, index.php matches the index.php locally as it does remotely. So that's it. So if it comes up again, I'll try to do it. So that's setting up. I forgot my notes here. Yeah. So like, I didn't put that link at the bottom, but there's a JetBrains website has how to set this thing up. One of the options they give you is actually called JIT, just in time, and there's almost never a reason to do that. So what just in time will do will basically say, like, if there's an error, then I'm going to set a breakpoint. But you almost never have to do that, and I wouldn't recommend setting it up that way. Right, so we mentioned you can set it up other ways where you can actually have a browser extension that you trigger to start it, but I don't recommend setting it up that way. So let's get into the actual debugging itself. So one way to do things without actually setting a breakpoint is just to have it break on the first line of a PHP script, which is what we were mentioning before. So if you go to this run menu item, the last last three things here is basically what you're going to be using. So break it first line in PHP scripts just says if stop at the first PHP code that you find when something gets hit. So we're just going to do that. So we haven't set a explicit breakpoint, and this can help debug some of the issues you may have if you're not finding your breakpoints being hit. So let's trigger a page load. And then it stops right away. So here are the basics. Can everybody kind of see? Should be big enough, I think, right? Okay. So how many people are already familiar with this process? Okay, so not everyone. That's good. All right, so the way step debugging works is it breaks at a line of code. It doesn't actually run that line of code, right? So it's sort of waiting for it. It's like, hey, do you want me to do this? And we can traverse around and in and out of code. So you can think of it as sort of a big tree, right? So if something calls a function, so this is a require once, I can either step over it, which would just step to the next line on my current page, or it will actually step into the require once. So in this case, let me step into the require once. Okay, so here's my require once. It loads as autoloader. Let's say this is like sort of going down a path through the woods. I don't want to go down this path anymore. I want to go back to where I started from. I can step out, and that's what this is for, right? Step out. So step out brings me back out of that, back up to the main path I was on. Step over, so here's a new Drupal kernel. Anything that new Drupal, so this kicks off a whole bunch of stuff. I'm just skipping, the breakpoint is going on to the next line on this page, 18. So it did a bunch of stuff. Whatever stuff had to happen in there, it did. Because I didn't step into it, I just stepped over it. Let's see. So let me just step through. So you can see here that it's actually showing me the value of these different variables, which is super useful. We have the variables down here below. Let me expand this a little bit. So, with DPM, you can only see, you can only sanely see what you actually wrapped, what variable you wrapped with DPM. Here you can see everything. All of your globals are here. All of your constants are here. And anything that's been set in the current frame. So, for instance, I can look at, let's see here. I can look at my request, and I can, just like DPM, I can dig down deeper and see what all of these values are. Are any cookies set? There's some parameters. Okay, so here's all my cookies. So it's more of an exploratory process than a sort of shot in the dark. Maybe this is it. Let me see what it prints out. With this, this can be a lot of information to sort of, the variables are usually at the top and the constants are at the bottom. But you may want to sort of pick out specific information that you want to keep an eye on. And that's what watches do. So in here, let's say I set a watch point for, base path. So I created a new watch for base path. And so as things change, base path, if base path changes, then it will be, I can see it right on my watches list. So that can be really useful, just to highlight things that you're interested in. If you're in Drupal 7, you can use the global user. In Drupal 8, there's no global user, so I was actually playing with that before here. It's a little bit more tricky. But let's say I do want to get the global user right now. I can use evaluate expression, and I can call Drupal, this should work, Drupal pipe current user. And now I have the current user. So even though that variable wasn't set in this frame, I can call some code and actually get the result and look at it, right? So I can see that, okay, I'm user 1. I can see what my email is, password, hashed, all that fun stuff. So that can be really useful. Otherwise, you end up setting variables temporarily, and then you forget to take them out, right? So the idea is to not have to change your code if you don't have to. Okay. So we went through most of these debugging basics. So let's start setting some breakpoints. So we really haven't set a breakpoint yet. Let's go to our user module. So let's say we're at the sprint weekend last weekend, and we're trying to work on some user module. This is actually Drupal 8.4, and we want to actually implement some new features for the user module. It's a pretty terrible idea. It basically just says anytime you're on the you see a user form, it should output a Drupal message that just says stuff, right? So not a very useful feature, but we can see how we could go about doing that. So here I can set, or I've already got a breakpoint set. Let me unset it to reset it. All right, so just clicking here on the left-hand side sets a breakpoint for me. So now if I finish out this process by hitting the play button, that play button just says keep going until you get to another breakpoint or until it completes. So I'm going to refresh the page. So you can see in the lower right-hand corner, it'll say waiting for, so that if you don't have everything full screen like this, it'll usually actually automatically move you over to your PHP storm. So it stopped at the first line. Let's go ahead and turn that off from now on. So I go back to run, turn off break at first line. So now it will only stop if there's a breakpoint that it finds. I'm going to hit play to say play to the next breakpoint. Okay, it hit our form alter because we're on the user edit page, and we can see that the form watch that we have has some values in it, right? So it's bringing in the form from here, and we can explore all of the entire form API array there. If we step over, we can see that message is not set to anything just yet, right? If I look down here, there's no message in my variables table. If I click down, that's when that line will actually be run, and now I can see that message is changed. What's nice is that it will highlight the color of recently changed variables. So even if something's like a very deep array, if something very deep got updated, it will highlight that as well. So it can make it very easy to find out, okay, well, what just happened maybe if there was a bunch of alters and things like that. You can also dig in with these and set them so maybe I don't want to run this breakpoint every single time. So I can look in and say, I only want this to stop if there's a specific something that happens, right? So I can set up, just like an if statement within a condition. So I can say, okay, only stop if, let's see, what's my form? What form am I on? User form. Okay, so only if form equals user form. All right, so I'm going to trigger it again, and it stops still. If I hit, I guess the only form on the page. So if I were to change this to some other form ID, then it wouldn't stop. So this can be useful to just, especially with Drupal calling alter hooks, there can be, for every module you have, there can be an alter, and it can be helpful to only stop at that breakpoint on a specific situation. So we did conditional breakpoints. There's other options here. We can also, sort of like DPM or like print statement, if you wanted to have that effect, we can have it set where every time it goes into this function, we can say, okay, what are all the forms that get, because it's just generic form alter, what are all the form alters that get sent through this? We can actually evaluate and log it. So we can, what is it? I think we can just do this, form ID. Trigger it again. And an output user form. So, so you can have this console, for instance, like, what are all the modules that have an alter hook? You wouldn't want to maybe step through all of them. You just sort of like to have an idea of it. You can just use the log functionality. Check minutes. Any changes so far, or any questions so far? So a lot of this is like, I could sit here and show you it, but right, it's going to take you to kind of jump in and play around with it a little bit. How are we on time? Okay. I want to leave a little time at the end for some questions. You can also have it not actually suspend. So let's say I don't want it to stop here, right? I want to set this breakpoint. I want it to log some information for me, but I actually don't want it to stop because I don't. So I can run this again. It completes, and just the user form is there. It didn't actually stop. So that can be helpful too. You can also turn on and off or see all of your breakpoints by clicking this view breakpoints. And you can enable them and disable them as you need. So let's see what I had here. So if you've noticed in my code here, PHP Storms helpfully said that I have an undefined variable. So one way to check why you're coding, to notice these notices and stuff ahead of time, is to set a breakpoint in the Drupal error handler. Normally, this should work, this is what I was trying earlier today, where you set it using the PHP exception breakpoints. But I think because Drupal has its own PHP error handler, that it sort of takes precedent and doesn't give you the opportunity. So, but if you go in and set that breakpoint, it'll give you something like this. So I'll kick it off again. And then anytime I, within my entire site, if it throws a notice and it goes through this error handler, then I'll be able to go in, look at what line, look at what the error was, and what the file name was, and fix my notices ahead of time. So instead of sort of relying on your PHP error log or your Drupal log, that you can fix these things, sort of just setting a breakpoint. If something goes awry and you've got maybe 100 breakpoints set. I usually have maybe between, 3 and 10 breakpoints set. You can just turn all of them off by muting them on the left-hand side. So that can be helpful. And then turn them back on. Let's see. So we talked about advanced breakpoints. And were there any other crazy ones? Oh, we didn't talk about the call stack. So if you've used Drupal debug, or excuse me, debug backtrace, then you sort of know how this works, right? You want to know, okay, what called me, and then what called the parent of that, and what called the parent of that function, and all the way up to index.php, right? So back in the day, you would use, say, DPM, you would throw debug backtrace in, or DD backtrace. But here you have it where not only can you see the variables in your scope of the function I'm in right now, I can go up the stack and see what the variables are in those scopes. So if I wanted to go back up, here's my stack. So this is where I'm at right now. This is what called it. This is what called that, and on up. So I can go to all the way to index.php, right? So this was all kicked off by this kernel handle request. And I can see in detail like what the request is and all that. So if you're dealing with something like form alters and things like that, it can be very tricky to know just by setting a value. Well, what called me? How did I even get here? Sometimes you'll have a function being called 1,000 times. So how did it get there, and why does it exist? So using your stack trace, basically, that you can interactively go through, you can see the variables that are set, and you can even change them on the fly. We didn't show that yet. So let's go back to our user module thing that we're working on. So one side effect of this, of stepping through things, is it ends up opening a tab for everything. So it can be a little bit of annoying to have to close everything out. But so where's our breakpoints? Let's turn off errors. Bring up our breakpoint. All right, so in this case, it just outputs the message of stuff at the top of the page. Well, let's say we want to, there's some weird situation where, I don't know, something gets set to null, right? Or a value needs to change. We could go back in and just change the value, but now we've changed our code, right? And remember, we're trying to avoid having to change our code unnecessarily. So in this case, we can Make sure this is set to a real breakpoint. Let's restart. Okay. So remember, it doesn't when it's highlighted, it hasn't run it yet. So with message equals stuff, if I step down, now message is equal stuff down here, right? Everybody see that? I know it's tough. So let's change stuff to something else. We can right click and do set value. Now we can change this to something else that's maybe some error case that we're trying to make sure that we wrote the right code for. So let's change it to other. If I continue now and look at the page, it's set to other. So again, that can be really useful when you can set even sub-elements of arrays and things like that. So it can be really useful if you're trying to debug intermittent cases, like when this value is set to this odd value, how does my code handle it? And you can test that without actually having to do anything in your code directly, hard code anything. So that's all I have. Any questions?
Questions?
So on my system, the debugger goes to the private directory. Is that a situation you've ever come across? Well, I'm working locally.
What do you mean private directory?
In the Mac, right? So it does everything in the private, and then it symlinks everything into the var, or something along those lines. But on my debugger, I end up always on the private file, not on the actual file. Does that sound like my setup or something you've come across?
I don't know. Does anyone have some insight into that? I'm not sure what you mean by private, so. Okay.
Apple has symlinks for Etsy to private, and there's like a strange thing that they did. And so I think it's how you installed Xdebug, actually. It's a guess.
I mean, just as a participant observer, I have not found any issues with Xdebug and symlinks at all. But I have found issues with symlinks that have nothing to do with Xdebug, that have to do with other things like running VMs or certain software that doesn't like things like spaces or other things that you might be doing specifically that could break everything else. So that's something maybe to take a look at.
Yeah, I was just wondering if someone had come across that, because I have a feeling it's just a setting somewhere. Instead of going directly to my actual file, it's going, it's bypassing that and going to the private.
Well, I'll try to show that. So I have this little thing that works with my Drush where I can actually set --xdebug. Drush normally doesn't allow for this. So I can set --xdebug and it will turn on xdebug for my CLI. So I've just kicked that off, and if I look back, this is the type of error you'll get. So it says, now it's running Drush inside of a Docker container. So it's saying I can't find a source position. So I think this is basically what you would see, right? So you have to just configure your servers, and this is where you set up those mappings I was talking about earlier. So it's saying I have code, where is it? Is it down here? So in this case, it's not saying it's missing a specific piece of code, but usually say like, which index.php do you want me to use? So in this case, I've got my local doc root, and I actually have two doc roots. Maybe it's supposed to come out of the other folder for some reason. But I've got this doc root shared, and this is where I set the path on the server. So if I go into the server, and I'll do this in a tab. Oh, God. I'm just going to kill the process, okay? And I'll go into my server. So hoy shell CLI. So this is the location of that file on the server, right? Can you guys see that? I'll pump it up a little bit. So it's var www on the server, but on my local machine, it's users Frank Carey Docker share Drupal 8 ahoy, right? So you've just got to map those two things together. Now in this case, I'm using Drush, right? So Drush is running inside, so you can use this include path as well. Let's see. You can set up include paths, I think. I'll have to show that another time. So you can set up include paths as well. So things like, you've got Drush installed globally, for instance. You would just add those include paths, and then it can find Drush. Even running remotely, it can map those files up when it's trying to set breakpoints to what you have locally.
Yeah, that's probably it. That's probably what I'll need to look at to sort this out. And just one other thing with this, you can end run around this front end if you go into the idea directory. And I think it's a config XML. I forget which one it is because we've struggled with that too. Sometimes you open up one of those fields in the PHP Storm, like we were just doing, and you can't find the thing you want. And then I don't know what that is. I submitted a ticket to them. They didn't get back to me. So
you're saying that some people commit their idea files into the actual repo so that people can share them across machines. We don't usually do that because people may have different settings, but I think a lot of those, for instance, let's see, Docker, is that in here? No. So there's some settings that I think you can actually set so that if everybody's working on the same system, then everybody can share those files. They don't have to worry about setting up the mappings.
Or you just seem to have the same problem that I've had. You're in the dialogue there, and you're trying to type something, and it won't type.
Oh, that's what you mean?
That's sort of a problem we've solved by just finding the right place in whichever config file it is in the idea directory. Like, well, can you type in there?
It doesn't seem to be.
Right.
I think the include paths are just like another setting in here.
Okay. One time, I think it was the where you have var doc root. We couldn't get it to work right, so we just ended up editing the config file. FYI.
Right. So yeah, if you go under languages and frameworks, you can add include paths. So that might be to your, Drush or Global Composer or whatever it would be, if you want to debug that stuff.
Thanks.
There is one other trick about Drush I just wanted to mention. If you want to debug Drush commands themselves, or something within Drush, generally what I do is, or I've had people do in the past, is you normally, if on your host machine, like say your Mac in this case, you have Drush running and you're not just containerizing it, you want to symlink it into your project because IDEA projects, any of these IntelliJ projects, do not like debugging anything that's outside of your project group. So that's just one other trick. But if you
that's where the include paths work.
Right, exactly, and that can help. But you can do that. You can override that in various ways with symlink. So that's another way to do it.
French, so you evaluated an expression. Can you inject an expression into the scope? So you can set a breakpoint, but then you could also just execute some new code to maybe set state.
Right. So if we were here and we run an expression, I think it's local to that where that was run. So we could sort of test that out. I'm curious myself. So we just got our breakpoint set, and where's our browser? Refresh our page. So again, here's another, because I changed it, this is the warning you'll see, right? It's saying incoming connection. Where should I have these mappings? So the file on the server is var.docroot index.php. Which one is that in? Because I have two doc roots, right? So I want to use this. This is the right pairing between what's on the server and what's local. Hit accept. I don't know why that's open. PHP Storm. Okay. All right, so let's step over message. And now let's, in our watches, evaluate an expression. And we'll set message equals foo and evaluate. And it changed it. So now I can see here that it's changed it to foo.
Thanks.
Yep. Okay. So yeah, thank you, and please, next time you use DPM, feel a little dirty, and think about setting up your debugger.
Oh yeah, yeah. Do you want to announce the next?
Sure, why not?
Yeah. I'm not sure what the date is actually.
It's actually the first two. The next meetup will actually be on Wednesday, March 1st. We're always the first Wednesday of the month, so join us.
Cool. Awesome. Yes, and I think it's time now we can hang out here for a few minutes, but then let's go down to Bill's Burger and Bar and drink some Fastly beer. It doesn't have to be drunk fastly, but thank you very much.